The air is cool on the limestone slope, and the scent of cedar resin rests lightly in the first pale light. Around you, the high groves of the Middle Atlas are still half in shadow, with old trunks rising from thin soil and scattered stone. Some of the trees are full and dark with needles, while others stand silvered and hollow, quiet signs that this forest is old and slowly changing. Nothing here feels hurried. The mountain keeps its water carefully, in cracks of limestone, in pockets of reddish earth, in the memory of winter snow. That hidden moisture lingers beneath moss, roots, and fallen needles, holding together a landscape that might otherwise seem too dry for such patient trees. As you move farther inward, bird song thins into distance, and the grove begins to feel less like a stand of separate cedars and more like one continuous living slope. Stone, shade, fungi, wind, and time are all part of the same slow arrangement here. And the deeper you follow that arrangement beneath the boughs, the more the mountain begins to reveal how these ancient trees remain. The path is hardly a path at all, only a gentler line between rock shelves where hooves, rainwater, and years of quiet passage have worn the ground a little smoother. Needles soften your steps. Small fragments of limestone shift under the duff, pale against the darker soil, and between them the roots of the cedars press downward in twisting lines, entering cracks too narrow to trust at first glance. That is the first thing the grove shows you, if you keep walking and do not stop at the beauty of the trunks alone. The trees are not simply standing on the mountain, they are reading it. Each root follows a scene where moisture lingers after snowmelt, and because of that, the difference between one cedar and the next can be written in only a few arm lengths of ground. On one side of the slope, a crown rises broad and dense, the needles deep green, the branch tips still full. A little farther on nearly the same incline, another cedar carries more sky through its limbs than shade beneath them. Its bark has loosened in long grey plates. Its upper branches are bare. The change is not random, and once you notice that, the grove becomes less serene in a simple way and more intricate. You begin to understand that the mountain is sorting its trees according to water, stone, and exposure, and that some are still being held while others are slowly being released. So there is a choice to make here. You could stay among the most impressive trunks, where the old trees gather the eye and the air smells strongest of resin. Or you could follow the quieter evidence, the thin bands of moss at the base of stones, the darker patches of earth, the places where young plants persist just a little longer into the dry season. It is the second path that explains the first. So you leave the easiest line through the grove and angle toward deeper shade, where the slope folds inward and the ground begins to keep more of what winter gave it. Almost at once, the spacing of the cedars changes. The trees stand closer together here. Their trunks are still separated by stone, but their canopies lean toward one another, meeting in loose dark layers overhead. The air cools by only a small degree, yet the difference is enough to feel on your face and wrists. With less sun reaching the floor, the fallen needles hold their color longer. The soil beneath them is darker. Near a limestone ledge, no taller than your knee, a thin line of green moss runs in and out of the rock like a tide mark. It does not look like much, but in a mountain grove, a line of moss is evidence. It means water pauses here. Perhaps not in streams visible from above, and not for long, but long enough. The limestone of these high slopes was once laid down under ancient seas, slowly built from marine sediments that hardened, lifted, and weathered over spans far beyond the memory of the forest itself. Now that old seabed forms the mountain's broken skin, rain and snow melt slip into joints and fissures. Some vanish quickly, some are held below the surface in pockets and channels, then returned little by little to roots that have learned exactly where to wait. Because the stone is fractured, the grove is uneven, not chaotic, only precise in a way that takes time to notice. On a ridge where the rock lies close to the surface, the cedars are shorter, the crowns bent and open, as if shaped by years of dry wind. In the shallow hollows between those ridges where reddish soil has collected and seepage lasts into spring, the trees rise taller and cast thicker shade. A mountain can look uniform from a distance and still be full of hidden rooms. Here, each room is measured in moisture. As you cross one of these subtle boundaries, the understory begins to answer back. Tufts of grass appear where the duff thins. A low herb with small rounded leaves clings to the cooler side of a stone. Lichens spread across old bark in pale maps, grey-green and powder blue, taking what little the air and light can spare. Nothing in this layer asks for attention loudly. Still, each small thing marks a place where the grove has enough water, enough shelter, enough time. And because these quieter lives gather in the same pockets, they show you where the mountain is still generous. A little farther upslope, the ground opens into a patch of exposed limestone, its surface pitted and grooved by long dissolution. The stone looks almost worked by hand, though it has only been shaped by water and patience. Runnels no wider than a finger thread downhill through the rock. Some still hold dampness in shadow, others have dried to a chalky pale. Cedar roots cross this stone in loops and braces, then disappear again into narrow cracks filled with wind-blown earth. It seems improbable that such large trees can stand on so little, but improbability is part of what gives the grove its stillness. The cedars are not thriving because the mountain is easy. They remain because the mountain stores hardship in a way that can be lived with. Winter is part of that bargain. Snow falls on these uplands when the air turns cold enough, and though the cover may be uneven, it matters deeply. Snow settles into hollows, drifts against trunks, melts slowly into soil pockets, and enters the limestone where roots will reach for it months later. A grove like this lives partly in delayed time. The coolness around you now may have begun as weather from another season. That is why a poor winter does not vanish when spring arrives. Its absence continues. It moves underground. It returns in thinner growth, in needles shed a little earlier, in saplings that stop short before their roots find depth. You can see hints of that delay even here, where the shade is stronger. At the foot of one cedar, several seedlings stand only a hand high, their needles soft and blue-green, their stems fine as wire. They are alive, but they are not equally alive. Two are upright and full. One has browned at the tip, another leans under a small crust of drying soil, as though the season has already asked too much of it. In a younger forest, such small differences might disappear into abundance. In a high mountain grove, growing slowly on stone, they are early chapters. The older trees above them have survived centuries by extending roots through faulted limestone and by narrowing their demands to match the ground's thin offerings. A seedling has no such reserves. It needs shade at the right hour, moisture at the right depth, fungi already present in the soil, a lucky crevice, a winter that lingers long enough. It is not enough for a cone to open and release seed. The mountain must agree. That agreement becomes easier to trace as you continue downward along a faint seam of darker earth. Here the surface is softer, and when you kneel to touch the ground, the needles give way to cool soil beneath. Fine white threads, almost too delicate to see, bind bits of earth and decayed wood together under the top layer. Fungal filaments run through this hidden weave, joining root to root, particle to particle, helping water remain where open ground would lose it. The grove is not held by trunks alone. It is held by contact. These underground partnerships are as old as forests. The cedar roots trade sugars made in sunlight for minerals and water gathered by fungi from spaces too small for roots to enter alone. On harsh slopes, that exchange can decide whether a seedling pauses through a dry month or disappears in it. So when you notice clusters of young cedar near old roots, or richer moss close to rotting wood, you are seeing more than coincidence. You are seeing an old system of sharing made visible at the surface. Beside a fallen branch, the signs become clearer. The wood is dry on the outside but damp below, and when it breaks gently at a touch, The inner fibers hold the scent of earth and resin together. Small beetles have passed through it. Fungi have entered after them. The branch that once shaded the slope is becoming sponge, shelter, and soil. This is another quiet law of the grove. Nothing is removed quickly. Even decline is useful. A standing trunk that has lost its crown still casts morning shadow. A fallen limb still slows runoff. A hollow log still cradles moisture after the surrounding duff has gone crisp. That is why the silvered trees do not feel separate from the green ones. They are not signs of absence alone. They are part of the same long metabolism. And yet, their increasing number does mean something. As you move farther into the grove, the pattern repeats, with enough consistency to become evidence rather than impression. The healthiest cedars are gathered where the slope cups inward, or where broken limestone traps deeper pockets of earth. The hollow and thinning ones stand more often on convex ground, on shallower shelves, on ridges that face more directly into heat and drying wind. Cause follows form. The mountain does not offer moisture evenly, so the grove cannot change evenly either. By now the sun has climbed enough to send light through openings in the canopy, but it reaches the forest floor in pieces, not broad sheets. One trunk glows amber where the bark catches it. Another remains cold and grey on the far side of a shadowed rock. Insects begin to move through the warmer shafts, slow and untroubled. A bird calls once, then again from farther off, and the sound fades among the branches, as if absorbed by wood. You keep following the slope's darker channels, because they have become the clearest way to read what sustains this place. At a shallow depression between two limestone ridges, the answer gathers all at once. The ground is cushioned with thicker needles. Moss spreads wider here, not only in a line but in soft patches. Young plants cluster at the base of several trunks, and the cedars above them rise straighter, their crowns overlapping in a way the exposed trees never do. It is not a spring in the usual sense. No open water glints between the roots. But the mountain is releasing something here, slowly enough that the grove can build a denser world around it. You linger because this small hollow explains the larger slope. Water that fell as snow or seeped through fractured limestone in late winter and spring has been delayed by stone, gathered by soil, and guarded by shade. Because of that, the air remains cooler. Because the air remains cooler, moisture leaves more slowly. Because moisture leaves more slowly, fungi persist, seedlings last, and the cedars above can keep a fuller canopy. This is how an ecosystem speaks when it is read through cause and effect instead of scenery alone. Every layer answers the one below it. And once you hear that answer, the grove grows more inhabited. A scrap of movement passes between trunks ahead, soft enough to seem like wind at first. Then it resolves into a Barbary macaque, grey-brown in the filtered light, moving low across a fallen log before pausing near the base of an old cedar. Another sits higher on a stone shelf, half turned toward the valley, still as bark, until its head lifts and the face catches light. They belong to these mountain forests in a way that deepens the sense of continuity rather than interrupts it. Not many are visible at once. A tailless shape in shadow, a hand against lichen, a quick inspection of needles and bark. They use the grove for shelter, for rest in warmer hours, for seeds and tender growth when available, and for the many small opportunities that open beneath an old canopy. The cedars do not merely stand above animal life. They moderate it. Shade changes the temperature of the ground. Roots hold the soil that supports grasses and herbs. Older trunks create roots, lookout points, and cavities. Even a fallen cedar extends the usefulness of the forest by becoming bridge, cover, and store of dampness. Near where the macaques passed, you find another sign of this larger community. Bark loosened by insects, then opened further by birds searching for them. The marks are small and methodical. Nothing torn, nothing wasted. In the high cedars, life tends to proceed by increments. A beetle enters weakened wood, a bird follows the sound, fungi move into the softened grain, moisture stays a little longer. Seeds catch in the roughened surface. The mountain prefers chains of consequence over spectacle. Above you, the boughs hold a thicker silence now, one shaped not by emptiness but by layered occupation. Small birds nest where branches fork near the trunk. Lichens filter light on older limbs. Ants navigate the bark's furrows as if traveling dry riverbeds. What seems still from a few paces away becomes busy, though never hurried, when you let the eye adjust to scale. This is the second change in understanding the grove asks of you. First, it teaches that trees follow water through stone. Then it teaches that once those trees are established, they create the conditions many other forms of life need in order to remain. The forest is not just growing on the mountain, it is also remaking the immediate mountain around itself, cooling it, binding it, darkening it, slowing it. And because it does that, any thinning of the canopy carries consequences that travel downward through every quieter layer. That consequence appears beside one of the older trunks, where a cedar has fallen long enough ago that the shape of its collapse has become part of the slope. Its root plate no longer towers raw and exposed. Soil has settled into it. Needles have drifted across the old wound. The trunk lies silvered along the contour, its wood opening in long fibrous seams, its interior dark and slightly cool. This fallen tree is not an ending placed in the middle of the grove. It is infrastructure. Seedlings rise close to its shaded side, where sun reaches them later and leaves earlier. Beetles have burrowed into the drier upper surfaces. Beneath, the damp side holds fungi, softened wood, and a richer scent of decomposition. The log catches leaves, slows small movements of water, and gives the slope a place to accumulate life that would otherwise slip downhill. So, you stop here, because this cedar on the ground makes a decision for the eye. It asks you to look at decline slowly. If a standing elder loses branches, more light reaches the floor. If more light reaches the floor, the soil warms sooner. If the soil warms sooner, moisture departs faster. If moisture departs faster, seedlings fail more often unless they find refuge beside rock, root, or rotting wood. That chain is quiet, but it is exact. And once you can trace it, the whole grove becomes more vulnerable and more impressive at once. A healthy old cedar is not only a tree, it is a climate held in wood and shade. The longer you remain near the fallen trunk, the more the surrounding details align around it. You notice how many seedlings choose the protected side. You notice a patch of herb growth thicker than the ground a few steps away. You notice that the bark of the nearest standing cedar is furrowed more deeply on the side that faces the open light, where exposure has worked on it for years. Even the sound changes subtly. Wind above the canopy arrives as a hush, then filters through needles and dead wood at different tones, as though the grove were answering its own weather in many voices. Farther upslope, another hollow trunk stands among greener neighbors, and it no longer reads as a single loss. It reads as a future condition, one that may spread where the mountain's stored water no longer lasts long enough to support what once stood easily here. That realization does not arrive as alarm. It arrives as pattern, and because it arrives through pattern, it feels harder to dismiss. So you keep walking with that pattern in mind, letting the slope explain itself a little more fully. The ground beneath the cedars is never only ground here. It is a thin agreement between shattered limestone, old needles, fungal threads, melting snow, and the small pores of shade. Where that agreement holds, the grove keeps its depth. Where it loosens, everything above begins to change. A little farther on, the mountain opens into another stony shelf, and the difference is immediate. The trees stand wider apart. Light reaches the forest floor earlier. The needle layer is thinner, and the soil beneath it feels lighter, less bound, as if it can no longer afford to keep what falls onto it. Even the scent changes. In the denser hollows, resin is mixed with cool earth. Here, the cedar smell is drier, cleaner, almost airy, and it drifts away more quickly on the moving morning air. These are small sensory shifts, but they tell the same story the trunks have already begun to tell. The mountain is not failing all at once. It is dividing its generosity. On this exposed shelf, the rock surface is close enough to touch in many places. It rises through the duff in pale knobs and broken edges, with shallow basins worn into it by long weathering. Some of those basins hold a little dust, a little darkened organic matter, enough for grasses to gather. Others are bare and white, bright under the lifting sun. You can imagine winter snow lying in these pockets for a while, softening into water. You can also imagine how quickly the same pockets dry once spring turns. That seasonal compression is one of the quiet pressures shaping the grove now. For much of its long history, the Atlas cedar has been matched to mountain climates where winter cold and snowpack stored moisture in slow form. The tree does not need constant wetness, it needs a rhythm. Cold enough winters, snow that remains long enough to seep down, springs that release moisture gradually instead of all at once, summers dry but not so early, and not so warm that the roots lose contact with stored water before the season has really settled. When that rhythm shifts, the cedars do not speak about it quickly. They answer in reduced growth, in thinner crowns, in branch tips that stop extending as far as they once did. Those answers take years to become visible, sometimes decades. That slow reply is why a mountain forest can seem stable even while it is already adjusting to conditions it did not evolve to expect. You can see one version of that adjustment in the spacing of younger trees. Near an old cedar whose trunk is broad enough to require several outstretched arms to encircle, there are hardly any saplings in the open ground beyond the canopy edge. Inside the tree's shade, though, and especially on the cooler side where morning light arrives late, a few small cedars remain. Their needles are denser, their stems more upright. The elder is doing what it has always done, creating a pocket of moderated air and ground beneath itself. But outside that pocket, the slope seems less forgiving than it once may have been. This is how thresholds first appear in landscapes like this. Not as a line painted clearly across the mountain, but as a narrowing of options. A seed can still land almost anywhere, yet only certain places still carry it forward. As the path curls along the contour, you begin to notice a repeated pairing. A vigorous cedar stands where a fold of land keeps a little more depth of soil. And not far away, on slightly raised ground, a tree of similar age looks drawn back from itself. Its crown is open. Its needles are sparse at the tips. A few limbs are bare. The contrast feels almost intimate because the distance between them is so small. A few paces, a subtle change in slope, a little more wind, a little less snow held over winter, a little less seepage reaching roots in spring. That is enough. In forests of deep alluvial soil, differences in condition may spread slowly through broad stands. In a high limestone grove, change can be sorted into very fine spaces. The mountain's geometry becomes the forest's future. There is another sign in the bark, if you stand long enough to notice it. On the healthier trees, resin has sealed old cracks into amber ridges. The bark remains furrowed, but continuous. On some of the drier trees, plates pull away more loosely, and the exposed surfaces beneath look faded, with less of that rich resinous tone. Resin is part of a tree's economy. It seals wounds, responds to stress, and costs energy to produce. When years are kind enough, or at least predictable enough, that economy can keep pace with weather, insects, and small injuries. When moisture becomes less reliable, the tree has less flexibility in what it can spare. So the outer bark begins to hold records of internal strain. Nothing is dramatic. Everything is legible. You move downslope again, following a narrow line where shade thickens under clustered boughs. A jay calls somewhere out of sight, then falls silent. The air under these denser branches feels stored, almost as if it had been held back from the day. In one patch of duff, the surface has been gently disturbed. Comb scales lie scattered there. A few seeds have been opened, perhaps by birds, perhaps by a small rodent in the night, perhaps by more than one quiet forager over several days. The cones themselves are a kind of weather clock. Atlas cedar cones mature slowly, taking time to develop, harden, and eventually release seed when conditions allow. A tree does not produce them with equal abundance every year. The effort depends on stored resources, on prior seasons, on whether the tree had enough moisture to support growth beyond maintenance alone. So even seedfall on the forest floor carries the signature of climate. A grove under strain may still fruit. Old trees are often capable of extraordinary persistence. But if poor years return too often, reproduction can become irregular, and the chances of successful establishment grow thinner still. You kneel beside one broken cone and turn it gently in your hand. Its scales are woody, fragrant, and still hold a faint warmth from the sun above. Not far away, a seedling no taller than your palm rises from a seam where cone scales, dust, and fungal-bound soil have collected against a stone. It is exactly the kind of place the mountain still permits. Protected on one side, shaded for part of the day, moisture lingering just a little longer after rain or melt. The future of the grove is beginning to gather in such places, not evenly across the whole slope, but in selective pockets. That realization leads you naturally upward in thought, toward the seasons themselves, because the ground has already made one thing clear. Water arrives here in pulses, and the entire grove depends on how those pulses are timed. So to understand what is changing, you have to move beyond one morning in the forest and let the year unfold around the cedars. In winter, these mountains can be austere and luminous. The limestone pales beneath snow. The trunks stand dark against it. Wind moves through the branches with a dry, high sound, and drifts form in hollows, along ledges, at the base of roots where the ground shape catches what falls. The cedars are built for that cold. Their needles endure frost. Their branch architecture can shed weight, though heavy snow still leaves its signature in bent limbs and old breaks. More important than appearance, though, is storage. Snow is the grove's quiet reservoir. Held above ground for weeks or months, it delays water into the part of the year when roots can begin to use it. A winter with generous snow does not simply brighten the mountain, it charges the system below. Meltwater enters fissures. Soil pockets remain damp longer. Mosses revive. Fungi stay active deeper into spring. Young cedar roots can extend a little farther before the dry season presses down. All of that is ordinary mountain function when the timing holds. And because it is ordinary, it can be easy to overlook how much depends on it. Spring in these groves is not lush in the way lower forests can be lush. It is restrained, clear, and very local. One hollow greens before another, a shaded crease beside stone carries moisture longer than an open patch nearby. The cedars themselves answer with new extension at their branch tips, with needle growth, with renewed sap flow. Bird activity shifts with it. Ground plants appear where enough cold moisture remains. The whole slope seems to wake by degrees rather than all at once. But spring is also when hidden deficits first become measurable. If winter snow was thin or melted too quickly under warmer air, the mountain enters spring with less in reserve. The trees may still green, the moss may still look revived for a while. Yet below the visible surface, the budget is tighter. Less water sits in fractures. Shallow soils begin drying earlier. Seedlings are asked to bridge longer dry intervals before their roots have enough reach. By early summer, the difference between a charged mountain and a depleted one becomes more obvious. The air warms, sun angles steepen, open shelves brighten into hard light. The resin scent grows stronger in heat, and under healthy canopies the shade remains cool enough to feel almost separate from the exposed ground beyond. This is when the cedars rely on what was stored, not on fresh abundance, because little fresh abundance comes, on delayed abundance, on snow translated into seepage, on cool pockets that lose moisture slowly, on fungal networks that make the most of thin reserves. A cedar that entered summer with enough access to deep moisture can hold its needles, maintain its canopy, and continue the slow work of living without obvious distress. A cedar that entered summer already near its limit may begin shedding older needles sooner. Branch tips may stop extending, sap flow may reduce, the crown begins to open, though perhaps so gradually that no single season seems responsible. This is why change in a forest like this must be read cumulatively. One warm year does not define the grove. Neither does one dry year, but repeated years of reduced snowpack, earlier melt, and longer warmth shift the baseline. They move the moment of strain earlier into the season. They make what used to be occasional hardship into a recurring condition. And trees, especially old trees adapted to old rhythms, carry those repeated conditions in wood. If you could sit with one cedar through many centuries, you would see a chronology not just in outward form, but in the grain itself. Each growing season leaves a ring, wide or narrow depending on what was possible that year. Years with more favorable moisture allow broader growth. Years of drought compress the record. A very old cedar may contain hundreds of such lines, each one a thin sentence about snow, cold, spring timing, and summer stress. Researchers who study mountain cedars have learned to read those lines, and the pattern is patient but unmistakable. In many stands, recent decades show more frequent narrow rings, especially where exposure is high and soil is thin. That does not mean every tree declines in step. Some sites remain buffered. Some individuals have deeper or luckier root access. Some north-facing slopes hold on longer. But the larger moisture calendar is changing, and the wood remembers. You do not need to hold a core sample in your hand to feel the meaning of that. It is already visible around you, in canopy gaps where elders once stood closer together, in crowns that are thinner on the sunward side, in the increasing importance of hollows, shadows, and moisture-retaining ground. The mountain is sorting for resilience more sharply now, and because the sorting is sharper, the character of the grove begins to separate into refuges and exposed losses. Late summer is where this becomes hardest to ignore. By then, the herb layer has mostly withdrawn on the drier shelves. Moss contracts into the deepest shade. The forest floor in open places loses its cool touch and turns friable underfoot. Needles crisp at the surface. The silver trunks of dead or dying trees catch more light than before, and their brightness among the darker canopies makes them stand out across the slope. This is not the sudden browning of a landscape collapsing all at once. It is a thinning, a reduction in density, in overlap, in the amount of shade the forest can cast on itself. And because cedars help preserve the very microclimate they need, that thinning changes more than appearance. It alters feedback. Once a canopy opens, sunlight reaches the ground for longer hours. Ground temperature rises, evaporation increases. The duff dries sooner after rain. Fungal activity may contract. Seedlings lose the protection of moderated air. The opening then becomes harder to refill with cedar, especially if the next winters are poor. That is how a grove can pass a subtle threshold. Not with a noise, with a sequence. A branch lost here, a thinner crown there, a gap that stays open, a seedling cohort that fails, a patch of shade becoming patchy enough that the ground beneath it no longer functions as it once did. The consequences spread slowly, but they do spread. You come to a stretch where that process has gone farther than before. Several old cedars stand on a gently convex rise. Two are still largely green, though more open than those in the moister hollows. Another keeps foliage only on portions of its crown. Beyond it, one tree is almost entirely silver, with a few small sprays of needles persisting on lower limbs. And beside them, the ground is changed, more grasses than seedlings, more light than coolness. The duff is thinner, interrupted by crusted soil and exposed stone. This is not a complete clearing. The grove is still present, but the internal climate has shifted enough that you can feel the difference before you even name it. Here is the midpoint the forest has been leading toward, a place where repeated dryness has already altered the pattern enough that return is no longer simple. An old cedar that has lost too much crown after successive droughts does not grow back into its former architecture quickly, if at all. A patch that has warmed and brightened may stop behaving like deep cedar shade even while some trunks still stand. The forest remains, but not in the same terms. This is what makes dieback in mountain groves so quiet and so consequential. It is not merely the death of individual trees, it is the loosening of an entire local arrangement of temperature, moisture, and renewal. You step carefully through this more open stand, and the evidence continues in details close to the ground. Needle fall is lighter. The soil surface is interrupted by fine cracking where it has dried repeatedly. A few small shrubs occupy spaces that dense shade once would have limited. At the base of one weakened cedar, the bark bears old insect galleries beneath loosened plates. Insects do not invent the stress. They often arrive where vigor has already declined. A tree living near the edge of its water budget has fewer reserves for defense. Its tissues are less buffered. Its resin response can be reduced, so secondary pressures become more successful. Again, the mountain prefers chains of consequence. The first cause may be climate and moisture timing. The later signs include insects, fungi, branch loss, and canopy opening. You pause near a trunk scarred by an old branch tear, and the interior wood is visible where bark never fully sealed over. The exposed grain is dry, hard, and fragrant. Above it, the remaining limbs still hold needles, but not densely. This tree is not gone. It is persisting. There is something deeply moving in that kind of persistence because it is so unspectacular. An elder cedar can survive for years, even decades, in reduced condition. It can hold some living crown. It can still cast some shade. It can still offer habitat, perch, bark, and structure to the grove around it. But it may no longer be building much future in its own wood. Its task has shifted from growth to endurance. Across these slopes, many trees are likely doing exactly that. Not thriving in the old sense, enduring in place, on reserves of age, root depth, and site luck. And endurance has limits that are reached unevenly. In one protected basin, those limits may still be far away. On an exposed shoulder, they may already be visible. The forest therefore becomes a mosaic of timings. Some parts still resemble the historical grove more closely, some parts are transitional. Some have crossed into a more open and uncertain state. That patchiness matters because it shapes what can happen next. If all the cedars changed equally, the story would be simpler, though no kinder. But because the mountain distributes moisture unevenly, it also distributes hope unevenly. Cooler microsites remain. North-facing slopes hold on. Deep soil pockets retain function. Fractured limestone continues to offer hidden roots for water where conditions allow. The grove is under pressure, but it is not uniform. That complexity is part of its resilience. It is also part of its fragility. You continue upward toward older stands, where the trees are larger, their forms more sculpted by time. Along the way, weather leaves traces everywhere. One cedar leans slightly downslope, perhaps from decades of snow pressure loading one side more than the other. Another carries a broad limb that sweeps outward before turning up, a shape that only years of repeated recovery could produce. There are old lightning scars, weathered smooth, hollows where branches once anchored, sections of bark blackened long ago and then grown around. The elders are archives, but not abstract ones. Their bodies hold the mountain's physical memory. In these oldest groves, age changes the feeling of space. The trees stand farther apart than in the denser moisture pockets below, yet each one occupies more of the air. Their crowns spread in horizontal tiers, blue-green against the pale sky. Their trunks are deeply furrowed, massive and often asymmetrical, broader on one side, indented on another, shaped by losses survived over centuries. To walk among them is to move inside long duration. No young forest gives this impression. Only very old trees can make time feel structural. One cedar in particular holds your attention. It rises from a shelf of limestone where the soil seems impossibly thin, its roots entering the mountain in several directions at once. The trunk swells at the base, then narrows and lifts into a crown broad enough to cast a wide island of shade. One side of that crown is fuller. The other is more open, with several dead branch stubs projecting pale against the darker needles. This asymmetry is not a flaw. It is biography. Perhaps snow repeatedly loaded one side. Perhaps prevailing dry winds worked more strongly from a certain direction. Perhaps drought years caused partial dieback in branches with poorer hydraulic connection. The tree is not trying to look balanced. It is trying to remain alive. Ancient cedars often contain hollow chambers in their trunks, especially after old injuries, fungal decay, or fire scars have slowly opened the inner wood. That can seem paradoxical at first. How can a tree so hollow remain standing so powerfully? But strength in old trees often lies in the living outer layers, in the architecture of wood distributed around emptiness, in roots that still hold, in a crown that has reduced itself enough to persist. A hollow cedar is not always near immediate collapse. It can remain for a long time, inhabited by birds, insects, shade, and silence, while still adding a little growth each year around the wound. That capacity for partial survival is one reason old groves feel so dignified. They do not depend on perfection, they depend on accommodation. You rest in the shade of that elder and look at the ground beneath it. The duff is deeper here than on the exposed shelves. Needles have gathered in layered mats. Cone scales lie among them. There is a coolness in the soil that survives later into the day. A few seedling cedars are present, though not many. This, too, is part of the story. Longevity does not guarantee replacement. An elder can dominate a site for centuries, creating habitat and microclimate of extraordinary value, yet still leave only occasional descendants that manage to establish nearby. Successful regeneration in these mountains is episodic. A favorable run of winters, enough snow, a sequence of springs not too abrupt, shade in the right places. And even then, most of those small trees will disappear before they are old enough to cast much shade of their own. That is why the presence of elders feels so weighty here. They are not simply old because time has passed through them. They are old because so many conditions aligned and kept aligning long enough for age to accumulate in wood. When one of these great cedars survives into many human lifetimes, it is holding more than mass and bark. It is holding a rare continuity of seasons that were once cold enough, wet enough, and regular enough to let growth proceed by patient increments. You can see that continuity in the trunk itself. The furrows run deep enough to collect shadow at midday. Resin has dried in thin amber seams where old wounds sealed years ago. Higher up, broad limbs leave the trunk at deliberate angles, each one like a decision made under older skies. Some branches broke long ago under snow or wind, and the tree adjusted around their absence. Others still spread in layered platforms, carrying needles and soft blue-green fans. Nothing about the form is accidental. Every curve belongs to recovery. A younger cedar often appears clean in outline. Its crown is narrower, more symmetrical, less marked by interruption. An ancient one is different. It bears weather in visible ways. The crown may lean a little toward a safer exposure. One side may be fuller because roots below found deeper access there. A hollow may open in the trunk where decay entered after some forgotten injury. Even so, the tree continues. The living tissue runs in a thin outer band beneath bark, lifting water and storing sugars, while the inner architecture keeps enough strength to stand. This separation between living edge and older interior is part of what allows great age. A cedar does not need every part of itself to remain equally active. It needs enough working pathways, enough support, enough leaf area to balance what the roots can supply. So age in this grove is often a matter of reduction, not expansion. An elder survives by becoming selective. It lets go of certain branches. It thickens where stress requires thickening. It narrows its demands. It learns the mountain more exactly with every difficult decade. That is one reason these old stands feel calm rather than dramatic. The trees are not straining toward anything. They are holding a practiced arrangement. you begin to notice how much empty air matters among them. The elders are spaced wide enough for light to travel between their crowns, yet the ground beneath each tree still carries its own climate. Step into the shade of one trunk, and the air cools. Step back into the open strip between them, and the warmth returns at once. These small contrasts matter enormously to seedlings, fungi, insects, and soil moisture. A broad old crown does not only shelter itself, it modifies the limestone below, reduces evaporation, slows needle breakdown, and protects the thin organic layer from hard sun. Remove such a crown, and the change moves downward through every quieter layer. That is what makes the loss of an elder different from the loss of a younger tree. A young cedar can be replaced, at least in principle, within a span the mountain readily understands. An old cedar may represent several centuries of accumulated structure. Its bark holds lichens that have occupied the same ridges for years. Its limbs contain nesting places that did not exist when the tree was small. Its shade has cooled one patch of ground through hundreds of summers. Its roots have long been part of the fungal exchange beneath nearby soil. When it falls, the forest does not become empty, but it does become younger, brighter, and less buffered in that exact place. The interval before a similar canopy returns can be very long, sometimes far longer than a human life. That is why the oldest groves carry a kind of ecological memory, not memory in thought, but in form. They preserve what this mountain climate made possible over long spans. They show what repeated seasons of snow, thaw, and restrained summer dryness could build when the rhythm held. And by comparison, they also reveal what becomes difficult when that rhythm loosens. You move from one elder to the next, letting the grove speak through differences in posture and condition. One massive trunk rises whole and dark, with a crown still broad enough to cast a nearly circular shadow. Nearby, another of similar size is open on one side, its old branches reduced to pale stubs where foliage never returned. At their feet, the ground tells the same unequal story. Under the fuller tree, the duff lies deeper, and the soil remains cool a little farther into the afternoon. Under the thinner one, the surface is more broken, with patches of exposed mineral soil and herbs that tolerate extra light. The distinction is subtle, but it is not temporary. It is the visible effect of years added together. This is where the grove's emotional weight deepens without any need for sharp language. A diminished elder is still beautiful. Its hollows hold darkness softly. Its bark still warms in morning light. Birds still use it. Insects still move through the dry outer wood. But the tree is no longer doing all that it once did for the ground beneath it. The reduced crown means reduced moderation. And because moderation is one of the grove's central gifts to itself, the effect spreads beyond the individual. You sit for a while beside a root flare that rises from the limestone like folded stone itself. From here, the mountain seems to breathe very slowly. Light shifts through the crown. A jay lands, waits, then slips away again. Somewhere farther off, a macaque moves through branches with that quiet, practical confidence of an animal entirely at home among old trees. Nothing calls attention to change loudly. Yet the signs remain. This stand of elders is not untouched. Some trunks are thriving less than they once did. Some crowns are carrying old strain. And because these trees cannot be replaced quickly, the future of the grove is becoming more dependent on where younger generations can establish under the right local conditions. That thought lowers your attention naturally from the crowns to the ground. Around the base of one ancient cedar, cones lie in different stages of weathering. Some are fresh enough to hold their scales tightly, others have opened and fallen apart into woody fragments among the needles. A few seeds remain lodged in the duff, dark and small, easy to miss unless you kneel. This is where the future first enters the grove in material form, not as a broad promise spread equally across the slope, as individual chances. A seed released from a high branch may land on bare limestone and dry within days. Another may settle into a crack lined with dust, needles, fungal threads, and enough lingering moisture to begin. A third may germinate, lift a tiny stem, and then fail in its first difficult summer. Successful regeneration is always selective here. Now it is becoming more selective still. The old idea of a grove renewing itself evenly from edge to edge no longer fits what the mountain is showing. Instead, the pattern is retreating into cooler pockets and better protected aspects, north-facing hollows, shaded ledges, the leeward side of fallen trunks, crevices where thin soil does not dry all at once, small terraces where snow once drifted deeper and still sometimes does. These places do not look dramatic. Most are only slight adjustments in exposure and storage. But for a cedar seedling, slight adjustments are the difference between persistence and absence. You follow one such line of promise down a little fold in the slope. At first, there seems to be nothing unusual there. Then the eye begins to sort the details. The stone faces away from the strongest afternoon light. The soil between rocks is darker. Old needlefall has collected in a shallow seam. There is a trace of moss tucked under one overhang, and beneath a broken branch, several young cedars stand at different ages, from first-year sprouts to stems a little thicker and taller, already beginning to show the tiered habit of the species. This is not abundance. It is a nursery. A small one, easily overlooked if you were looking only for grand trees. Yet it may tell you more about the grove's future than the broad crowns above. These seedlings are not scattered randomly. They are concentrated where conditions still resemble the older forest's internal climate. The mountain is no longer offering equal opportunity. It is creating refuges. That word matters because it changes the scale of hope. A refuge is not a guarantee. It is a place where continuation remains possible. In a warming, drying grove, continuation often moves into fragments before it disappears entirely. The fragments become disproportionately important. You examine the little hollow more closely. A fallen twig shades one side. The rock beside it remains cool enough to touch without warmth. A thin mat of decayed needles holds moisture beneath the surface, even though nearby open ground has already dried. The seedlings are not vigorous in any extravagant sense. They are simply present and still green. That presence is a kind of evidence. It says that local conditions can still carry cedar life forward, even if the larger slope is becoming less reliable. This is one of the mountain's quieter answers to change. Not resistance everywhere, persistence somewhere. Once you notice this, the landscape begins to arrange itself into categories of future. Some places are largely historical now, holding old trees but offering little successful replacement. Some are transitional, with weakened elders and occasional scattered seedlings that may or may not persist. Some are refugial, still cool and sheltered enough to support small cohorts of young cedars. And all of this can occur within a relatively short walk. The mountain's fine topography matters that much. Aspect matters. Rock depth matters. Wind exposure matters. The angle of the afternoon sun matters. Even the shape of a single outcrop can determine whether snow lingers just long enough in winter to influence what survives below it in summer. So you begin tracing these refuges one by one, as if reading hidden punctuation in the slope. A north-facing crease beneath clustered boulders holds 2-year-old seedlings among grasses. A shallow basin under an old canopy supports a few more, though several show brown tips where the season has already tested them. The protected side of a decaying log shelters a line of tiny stems, all leaning slightly toward the small strip of filtered light available between roots and stone. Farther down, where the forest opens and afternoon heat enters too early, the same search reveals almost nothing. The pattern repeats so clearly that it becomes the central fact of this part of the mountain. Regeneration remains possible, but it is being pushed into the quietest corners. That concentration has consequences. On the one hand, it means the cedar landscape is not simply ending. Young trees are still finding purchase. The species is still writing forward into time. On the other hand, the future grove will not be arranged exactly like the old one. Its continuity is becoming uneven. Dense, historical stands on exposed shelves may thin without equivalent replacement. Cool pockets may retain cedar character, while adjacent ground shifts toward a more open and mixed structure. The result is not a single event. It is a rearrangement of pattern. That rearrangement is already visible if you let your attention move between scales. At the scale of the mountain, the grove still appears broad and enduring. At the scale of individual stands, differences become clearer. At the scale of roots, seedlings, and shaded crevices, the future narrows into very specific places. This multi-layered view is part of what makes the cedar slopes feel so ancient and so immediate at once. Age is all around you. So is selection happening in real time. The grove is both archive and experiment. A small bird drops into the undergrowth near one seedling cluster, then flicks away again with a seed husk in its beak. Even this brief movement belongs to the same system. Birds feed among cones, macaques disturb duff and expose small patches of soil, insects enter deadwood and help turn it toward nurse substrate. Fungi bind particles and extend root reach. A fallen cedar shades a narrow strip of ground. Shade keeps moisture. Moisture permits another seedling year. No single piece is enough. Together, they create the limited spaces where continuation remains possible. You pass into another opening where the old canopy has thinned and the contrast sharpens. There are cones here too, and seeds certainly arrive. But the ground is harder, the soil shallower, the duff less continuous. A few young plants of other kinds have established in the extra light. The cedar seedlings are absent. This is important because it prevents a simple story. Seed production alone is not renewal. Presence of old trees alone is not renewal. Even shade alone may not be enough. If it is too brief, too broken, or paired with a winter that stored too little moisture below. Regeneration is the meeting point of many conditions, and those meetings are now less frequent in the open. You stop beside a small sapling, perhaps several years old, though still no higher than your knee. Its growth has been slow, the spaces between whorls are short, its needles are healthy but not lush. This little tree has likely spent each summer balancing close to its limits, and yet it remains. In that persistence you can read what the grove increasingly asks of its young, not speed. Endurance from the very beginning. A slow accumulation of root depth before several difficult years arrive in sequence. Protection enough to survive repeated stress before any real height is gained. It is an exacting path into adulthood. That difficulty changes how you look back at the elders. Their great forms no longer seem merely impressive. They seem statistically improbable in the best sense. Each one is a survivor of many thresholds already crossed. Cold winters, injuries sealed, years of poor cone production survived, enough favorable intervals to add wood little by little. And now, in this altered moisture calendar, the mountain is asking a different sequence of questions from the next generation. The answers will not be uniform. They will vary by hollow, by slope, by hidden seepage line, by canopy remnant, by luck. That is why the most honest way to stay with the grove is to keep moving between what has been lost and what still quietly persists. One without the other would be incomplete, so you continue along the shaded side of the old stand, following cones and seedling traces into evening light. The air has changed almost without your noticing. Afternoon warmth begins to loosen its hold. The resin scent returns in a deeper way as the stone cools. Shadows lengthen across the limestone shelves, joining together beneath the trees until separate patches of shade become one continuous dimness. This cooling reveals another layer of the grove's structure. Places that seemed only slightly different at midday now separate more clearly. The open shelves give back their heat slowly. The protected hollows cool sooner. Moist air settles low where the forest floor is deepest. The trunks darken in tone, and the whole mountain begins to gather itself toward night. This evening transition matters ecologically as much as it matters to the senses. Night is when evaporation stops drawing so hard from the surface. It is when leaves and needles recover some of the moisture tension built through the day. It is when the temperature gradient between shaded hollows and exposed rock briefly shifts in favor of retention rather than loss. A forest that can hold coolness through evening and night gains a little resilience. A forest opened too widely loses that advantage sooner. Once again, the effect is small at the scale of hours, but cumulative at the scale of seasons. Under the oldest cedars, the cooling shade feels almost sheltered from time. The bark releases a faint scent of dust and resin together. Needles underfoot soften every step. The silence is not complete, but it is layered so gently that each sound seems to settle rather than travel. Somewhere upslope, a bird makes a last short call. Then the mountain returns to breathing in its own patient way. You come to a place where several ancient trunks stand in a loose circle around a slight depression in the ground. The hollow is no more than a broad bowl, filled with needles, cone fragments, and stone at the edges. But it clearly collects more than the surrounding slope. Snow would gather here, cold air would linger a little longer on clear nights, water moving through the duff would slow before entering the fractured limestone below. And because of those small advantages, the floor of the depression contains more young life than the nearby open ground. Not many seedlings, but enough to show a pattern. This is the sort of microclimate that may become increasingly important. Not because it can save the whole grove by itself, but because it can preserve continuity through difficult intervals. A series of harsh years may erase recruitment on exposed ridges. The same years may still allow a few survivors in a shaded basin like this. Then, if a sequence of kinder winters returns, those survivors become the beginnings of the next stand structure. Forest continuity in marginal climates often works this way. Not as a smooth procession, but as pulses buffered by refuges, this understanding adds texture to the grove's future. It is not only a story of decline, it is also a story of uneven persistence. The cedar landscape is being reduced in places, yes. Ancient shade is thinning in some stands, yes. But the mountain still contains small engines of renewal. Protected pockets still hold enough of the old conditions to keep seeds alive. And as long as they do, the pattern is not finished. You keep circling these pockets, because each one teaches the same lesson in a slightly different dialect of stone and light. One owes its coolness to depth of soil caught in a limestone fracture field. Another to the shadow cast by a massive elder with a still intact crown. Another to slope orientation, turning away from the strongest summer exposure. Another to dead wood that has slowed runoff and kept organic matter from slipping downhill. Together they form a scattered map of resilience. This map is more fragmented than the historical grove likely was, but fragmentation is not the same as silence. The mountain is still speaking through what remains possible. Evening deepens further, and the oldest trunks begin to lose detail against the sky. Only their outlines remain sharp now. Broad lower limbs, tiered crowns, irregular tops where snow, wind, or drought took what they needed and left the rest. In this fading light, the cedars seem less like separate organisms and more like a long, elevated terrain made of wood. The grove becomes architecture, a roof of old branches, columns rooted in stone, open chambers of shadow between them. It is easy, standing here, to understand why people have long felt something almost ceremonial in old cedar forests. Not because the trees ask for reverence, they ask for nothing, but because their patience is so visible. They hold stillness in a convincing way. And when that stillness is complicated by signs of strain, by thinning canopies and concentrated regeneration, the place becomes even more affecting. It is not perfect, and because it is not perfect, it becomes more fully real. You move on through that dim architecture until the slope broadens, and the forest floor begins to offer fewer seedlings again. This is useful too. A refuge only means something when set against less favorable ground. Here, the canopy opens enough for dusk light to linger longer. The duff layer is broken. Stone shines pale through it. A few cones lie exposed, with no young cedar nearby. The future is not gathering here in the same way, and that difference suggests what the coming section of the mountain will show more clearly. The grove's continuity is now being negotiated in narrower bands than before. The cooling air carries the scent of dry herbs from the more open patches. Somewhere lower down, A night insect begins, then another. The grove does not become busy at dark. It simply changes register. Daybirds quiet. Small ground sounds emerge, branches lose their color and become shapes. The old trees remain where they have always remained, but the attention of the landscape lowers, from crowns to duff, from visible distance to near textures, from broad light to hidden retention. That lowering of attention prepares the ground for following seeds and saplings into the quietest parts of the slope. Because if the elders preserve memory, the seedlings preserve possibility. And possibility here is no longer spread generously. It gathers where cooling shade can still outlast the day. The path threads between two weathered trunks and enters one of those cooler bands almost by accident. At once, the air changes again. The temperature drops only a little, but enough that your skin notices before your eyes do. Under these branches, the day's stored warmth has thinned, and the ground seems to keep a more careful kind of cool. The limestone is darker here, dusted with old needles that have gathered in the lee of roots and stone. Small things begin to appear where a hotter patch would hold almost nothing. A seedling cedar stands in the crease between two rocks, its stem straight, its needles fine and matte in the dim light. Not far from it, another has emerged beside a decaying cone, as if the parent tree has quietly laid down both shelter and beginning in one place. You crouch and look more closely, because the difference between a living future and a failed one is often only a few fingers' width of ground. The soil here is still loose beneath the surface. It has not hardened into a crust. It still parts gently under a touch, and under the top layer there is a trace of dampness that would already be gone in open light. That is enough to explain why this pocket keeps young cedars when other places do not. The shade arrives earlier, it leaves later, the air moves less. Needles accumulate and hold organic matter in place. Fungal threads remain active longer. The mountain has made a small room where the old rhythm persists a little more faithfully than it does outside. That persistence is not dramatic, but it is decisive. In a drying grove, the future does not spread from every cone that opens. It passes through these selected places, one cool depression, one north-facing seam, one protected root hollow at a time. You move slowly through the band of shade, and again the same pattern repeats. A fallen branch catches wind-blown litter. Beneath it, two seedlings. A slight terrace behind a limestone lip holds deeper duff. There, three more. The shaded side of a broad old trunk supports a line of tiny stems, all within the area where the crown still throws its evening shadow. Outside that line, the ground empties almost at once, so the grove is drawing its next map in fragments. Not broad, confident fragments, but careful ones. This does not make the young trees less real. If anything, it makes each one feel more exact. A sapling that survives here is not just lucky, it is placed within a network of conditions that had to meet at the right moment. The seed had to arrive, moisture had to linger, the fungal partners had to be present. The canopy above had to remain intact enough, long enough, to moderate heat through the first dangerous summers. When all of that happens together, the result may still be only a knee-high cedar after several years. But in a mountain grove, small stature does not mean small achievement. The shortest trees often hold the longest negotiations. The light is fading now in a way that softens edges without erasing them. Older trunks stand as dark columns, and the spaces between them begin to fill with blue-grey air. On the forest floor, cone scales catch what little light remains and look almost pale against the duff. The seedlings are harder to see unless you are looking directly for them. That feels appropriate. The future of the grove is becoming less obvious than its past. The elders announce themselves from a distance. The young do not. They wait in the cooling shade, easy to miss, easy to step around without noticing, though entire centuries may depend on such inconspicuous beginnings. You continue following these small signs because they offer the clearest answer to what remains possible on the slope. A few paces downslope, a shallow pocket between roots opens under an old cedar, whose crown is still fuller than most around it. Here, the floor is padded with layered needles. The air has the scent of resin mixed with soil, a richer smell than on the exposed shelves. Several cones have fallen and opened in place. Among them, a cluster of seedlings rises close together, too dense for all of them to remain in the long term, but dense enough to show that this tree, this shade, this exact patch of ground, still functions as a nursery. The explanation is direct once you stay with it. A broad crown reduces afternoon heating, a thick needle layer slows evaporation. Old roots support fungal exchange. The trunk itself breaks wind and modifies snow deposition in winter. If snow drifts a little deeper here, melt enters this ground more gradually. If the ground stays cooler longer, summer demand arrives less abruptly. The seedlings do not need abundance. They need a sequence that does not break too soon. That sequence still survives in some places. And because it still survives, the grove is not merely a collection of losses. It is a landscape of narrowing continuities. You begin to understand that the mountain is now offering fewer full successes, but also fewer total silences than a quick look might suggest. There are failures everywhere, yes. Openings where no cedar returns, thin crowns where once there was overlap, soils that warm too quickly. Yet there are also these pockets where the old arrangement remains legible. In them, the species is still behaving like itself. Cones open. Seeds settle. Seedlings wait. Growth is slow. Attrition is high. Still, some continue. The distinction matters because it changes the emotional shape of the grove. Without these younger pockets, the forest would feel like memory only. With them, it becomes something more difficult and more alive. It is memory still at work. A breeze moves above the canopy, and the sound does not travel as a rush. It arrives in layers, first through higher boughs, then lower branch tips, then the dry edges of deadwood, each with its own soft tone. The whole stand answers in muted voices. At the base of one trunk, a scatter of loosened bark marks where insects have fed in dry outer layers. A small bird has pecked among them. Nearby, a decaying limb has darkened into nursewood. Everywhere, processes are overlapping. Regeneration is not separate from decomposition. The future stands partly on what the old forest lets fall. This becomes clearest beside another cedar long down on the slope. Its trunk has opened along one side, exposing fibrous wood turned soft with time and fungi. The upper surface is pale and dry. The underside remains cool and moist enough to hold a dark band of richer decomposition. On the protected side, pressed between wood and stone, are three small cedars, each at a different stage. One is newly emerged, one is perhaps a year or two older, one has already survived enough seasons to begin stiffening into a real sapling. The fallen tree is doing what a standing tree once did, only differently. It no longer lifts water through a crown. Instead, it stores dampness, catches debris, and creates shadow close to the ground. Even in decline, the grove provides structure, so decline here is never only subtraction. It is also transformation, and the direction of that transformation matters. If deadwood remains, if old trunks lie where they fall, if root systems continue to anchor organic matter, then even a weakened stand retains some ability to support the next generation. If too many of those structures vanish from a patch already open to heat, the chance of cedar return shrinks further. Nothing in this system acts alone for very long. As dusk deepens, the distinction between favorable and unfavorable microsites becomes easier to feel than to see. Cool pockets seem to gather around your ankles. Open ground releases its warmth more slowly and holds a faint dryness in the air. You move from one to the other and begin to sense how a seedling experiences the slope. The mountain is not one climate. It is many nearby climates braided tightly together. On a broad map, these cedar groves occupy high country of the Middle Atlas. On the ground, they occupy an ever finer weave of exposure, depth, retained snow, slow seepage, and shading architecture. This is the scale at which their future is now being decided. The old idea of simply asking whether cedars remain in a region is too coarse. They do remain, but where precisely and under what combination of conditions now matters more than before. That precision has always existed. The mountain has never been uniform, yet the need for that precision has sharpened. When moisture was delivered in a colder, more predictable calendar, a wider range of sites could support cedar establishment. Now the workable range has narrowed. The margins matter more. A slight northward aspect can make a measurable difference. A small increase in soil depth can decide whether moisture lasts into the wrong part of summer. An old crown overhead can preserve a decade of seedling attempts that open ground would erase. It is a quieter form of drama than storms or fire, but no less consequential. The forest is being edited by subtleties. You stop beside a sapling perhaps 10 years old, though still slender enough to bend under a hand. Its branches are short and even. Its needles are healthy but sparse, compared with a well-watered young tree in easier ground. This cedar has not grown fast. It has held on. The branch whorls are close together, each year adding only a little height. And yet the root below may already be reading deep stone very well. That is one of the paradoxes of harsh landscapes. Progress above ground can look modest, while survival below ground becomes remarkably sophisticated. A young cedar here invests in persistence before form. It deepens first, if it can. It strengthens root contact. Only later, if years permit, does it begin to occupy more air. This is why open patches can be misleading. A slope may look only moderately altered from a distance. But if the recruitment of young trees has shifted from broad, low-level success to scattered, hidden persistence, the long-term structure of the grove is already changing. There will still be trees for a long time. Old ones can endure impressively. Middle-aged ones may hold the pattern for decades. Yet the age ladder beneath them becomes less even. And when the ladder narrows, so does the forest's ability to carry its own character forward. This thought stays with you as the evening grows cooler. Somewhere among the trunks, a night bird gives a low call and then is quiet. The mountain seems to exhale. The oldest crowns are now silhouettes, their tiers spreading against a sky that has lost most of its color. What remains in the grove is shape, scent, and ground detail. The smell of resin lifts more clearly in the cooling air. So does the mineral smell of limestone. Needles underfoot soften each step into almost no sound at all. When you look up, the great trunks feel less like objects and more like standing durations. When you look down, the seedlings feel like small, provisional answers to an old question. Can this grove continue to be itself? The answer, for now, is unevenly yes. But the yes is conditional. It depends on hidden storage, protected shade, and years not being too difficult in a row. It depends on old trees remaining long enough for young ones to establish beneath and near them. It depends on the mountain still making a few cool rooms inside its larger drying trend. That is why you stay low with the saplings a little longer. They are quiet evidence, and quiet evidence often tells the truth earliest. A seedling in a crack under a stone says more than a broad scenic view can say. It tells you exactly where continuity still fits, and because the grove has trained your attention to read that scale, the whole mountain after sunset begins to feel more articulate, not louder, more exact. The contours of the slope now guide cold air downward. Sheltered pockets darken first. Open limestone shelves hold the last diluted light. The surviving elders stand above this sorting process, but they also create it. Their crowns alter where frost settles, where dew may briefly form, where wind slows, where organic matter remains. An old grove is not passive in relation to weather. It shapes weather near the ground. That shaping is part of what younger trees need. So, as canopy structure changes, even slightly, local night conditions change with it. A broader crown can reduce the day's heating enough that evening coolness arrives earlier beneath it. A thinned crown allows deeper afternoon warming and a different overnight recovery. These are subtle effects, easy to ignore if you think only in terms of average climate. But forests live through accumulated subtleties. The mountain has taught that all day. Now, in the blue edge of night, the lesson becomes gentler and more complete. You leave the nursery pockets one by one and move toward a broader view through the trunks. The slope falls away westward in muted layers. Across the basin, other cedar stands darken into the limestone folds, some dense, some more broken, their forms nearly merging with the mountain itself. From this distance, the pattern of change is harder to pass. The groves still read as forest, and that is true. The Middle Atlas still holds these high cedar landscapes. But because you have spent the day within their finer textures, the distant view no longer feels simple. You know now that inside each dark band of woodland, there may be old hollows, failing ridges, cool refuges, fallen nurse logs, surviving saplings, and places where no young cedar is taking hold at all. Distance smooths reality. Proximity restores it, so you remain close to the trees. A limestone outcrop rises beside the path, pale at its upper edge, already dark where shadow has taken it. Its surface is etched with grooves left by water over very long spans. In some of those grooves, wind-blown soil has collected. In one, a single seedling cedar is rooted, no larger than a handspan, growing from what seems at first an impossible amount of earth. Yet impossibility has always been part of this species' quiet talent. Atlas cedar is a tree of margins held patiently. It does not ask the mountain to become generous in a broad lowland way. It accepts thin soils, fractured rock, cold winters, dry summers, but acceptance is not immunity. A species adapted to hardship is still adapted to a particular kind of hardship within a certain cadence. When the cadence shifts, even resilient trees must renegotiate. Some succeed, some persist only partly. Some sites cease to support what once grew there. The outcrop, the tiny seedling, the broad dark crowns above, all belong to that renegotiation. Night settles further, and the first stars are beginning to show in the openings between branches. The grove does not brighten under them. It becomes deeper. The spaces between trunks feel more spacious now, and the path is no longer a line to follow so much as a sense of where the ground remains level enough to continue. This is where the mountain after dark gathers all the earlier parts of the day into one atmosphere. You can feel the geology beneath the forest, because stone is still releasing and receiving heat at different rates. You can feel the hydrology in absence and retention, because some patches remain cool and damp while others have already gone dry. You can feel the biology in structure, because old crowns create the darkness where seedlings wait, and deadwood still shapes the floor. Nothing has to be explained aloud anymore for it to be present. The grove has become legible through repetition. Still, there is more to notice if you keep walking slowly. On one side of the path, a hollow trunk stands with an opening large enough to hold darkness almost as a substance. The wood around the cavity is thick, furrowed, and still alive in its outer band. This tree may remain for many years, or perhaps a winter storm, heavy snow, or simple gravity will one day bring it down. Either way, the grove is already adjusting around it. Its partial shade falls to one side. Its bark hosts lichens and insects. Its cavity offers shelter. Its future fall will alter the ground in a particular direction. Even now, nearby saplings have arranged themselves according to the conditions it still creates. That is another truth of old forests. Time does not wait for endings to begin its consequences. The consequences begin while the elder is still standing. Nearby, the ground under a fuller cedar is cushioned deeply enough that each step sinks slightly, almost as if the mountain were breathing through accumulated needles. There is a softness here unknown on the exposed shelves. When organic matter is allowed to build, the surface becomes more than a resting place for fallen debris. It becomes a slow reservoir, a temperature buffer, a nursery substrate, a fungal habitat, a bridge between stone and root. That bridge is fragile in dry climates. If repeated warmth and thinning canopies accelerate breakdown without replacement, The duff layer loses depth. Soils heat faster. The forest floor becomes less forgiving. This is another way change moves through the grove, not only by killing trees, but by making the ground itself less able to support the next generation. You kneel once more and sift gently through the top layer. Needles, cone scales, grains of reddish soil, a fine webbing of decomposition held together by fungal work. This material has accumulated over many seasons. Snow fed the roots that supported the crown, that produced the needles that built the duff that now shelters the seedlings that may one day create more shade. The cycle is simple to name but difficult to maintain. Break moisture timing enough, and every part of the cycle tightens. The crown thins, needle fall changes, shade weakens, duff dries. Seedlings fail more often. The grove grows younger in some places, only by losing the conditions that once allowed age. And yet, beside your hand, another small cedar rises through exactly that layered surface. The cycle is strained. It is not absent. That coexistence of strain and continuation is the real atmosphere of the mountain after dark. Not certainty, not collapse, a held question. You walk on until the grove opens briefly onto a wider shoulder of the slope. From here, the sky occupies more of the view, and the silhouettes of the cedars stand in broad intervals against it. The limestone beyond is pale enough to keep some memory of light. Farther down, darker folds hold groves that are already almost invisible. A faint owl call reaches from somewhere beyond the immediate stand, soft enough that it seems to belong to the air itself. Then again, silence, not empty silence. The kind that contains roots, cooling stone, insects under bark, and air settling down slope between ancient trunks. At this hour, the grove feels less like a place you are crossing and more like a set of relationships continuing without witness. That is perhaps why it is so peaceful. The cedars do not need to be looked at in order to remain what they are. They continue their exchanges under darkness. Water tension eases in needles. Fungi continue their silent negotiations with roots. Cold gathers in hollows. Resin scents the air and then fades. A dead limb releases a little more of itself into the forest floor. A seed lies where it landed. These are small motions, but together they are the life of the grove. When people think of change, they often imagine large, visible events. In mountain cedar forests, change usually arrives this way instead, through altered sequences of small motions. Slightly less snow, slightly earlier melt, slightly warmer stone under a thinned canopy, slightly poorer seedling survival outside refuges. Then, after enough years, a different forest pattern. The calm of the grove can almost conceal this. But concealment is not denial. The mountain is open about what is happening if you read it carefully enough. And because you have read it in bark, duff, seedling clusters, and old hollow crowns, the nighttime view becomes fuller rather than vaguer. Darkness simplifies the shapes and deepens the meaning. You turn back inward from the open shoulder and let the path carry you among the trunks again. Now the forest floor glimmers only where pale stone shows through. Elsewhere it is shadow, textured by roots and cones, and the low, irregular mounds of accumulated litter. A young cedar brushes your leg, so soft you notice it only after contact. It grew here because the old tree above still held enough of the day away. That relation feels immediate in the dark. The elder overhead is almost invisible. Its influence is not. As you continue, the altitude makes itself felt in another way. The air has thinned enough that coolness comes quickly now, even after a day of stored sun. Breath feels cleaner here, drier, touched by limestone and resin rather than by any deep valley softness. High mountain forests always live close to the edge of temperature. A small rise in altitude can mean later thaw, deeper frost, a longer hold of snow in shade. A small drop can mean earlier warmth, thinner winter cover, and a shorter season of underground recharge. That vertical difference is one reason the cedar landscape never behaves as one uniform band. It is arranged in steps, in belts of exposure and retention, in narrow changes that a walking body can feel before the eye fully explains them. You move onto a higher shoulder where the grove loosens around scattered stone. Here, some of the elders are shaped more heavily by winter than by anything else. One trunk divides low and broad, as if a heavy old snowpack once pressed it outward, year after year, until that form became permanent. Another has a candelabra crown, several main limbs rising from a thick center, each recovering after losses that no longer need to be named. Snow does not only feed these trees, it also sculpts them on upland slopes, repeated loading and shedding leave architecture in wood. A branch that bends and survives grows differently from then on. A limb that breaks opens a gap in the crown, and the tree redistributes growth around the absence. A trunk exposed to freeze and thaw year after year develops bark and grain under those conditions alone. So when you stand among the oldest cedars at this elevation, you are looking at climate made visible twice. Once in the annual rings hidden inside, and again in the outer form, broad, asymmetrical, patient, and never quite regular. The night air clarifies these shapes because it removes distraction. Without full daylight, you are less occupied by color. Form becomes easier to read. The tiered limbs stretch outward like shelves over shadow. The dead stubs glow pale where bark has worn away. The living sprays of needles hold a softer darkness, denser and quieter than the sky behind them. An ancient tree in daylight can seem monumental. At night, it seems measured. Every part of it feels like the result of long decisions made by weather and recovery together. This higher ground also changes the sounds of the grove. Wind has less distance to travel before it reaches the crowns. It comes over the mountain in smooth, cool layers, touching the upper boughs first, and then thinning as it drops into hollows below. Where the forest is open, you hear more of the mountain. Where the trees gather, you hear more of the grove answering back. The distinction is subtle, but exact. An exposed ridge carries a cleaner, drier whisper. A sheltered stand breaks the same movement into several textures: needle, branch, bark, deadwood, and the soft friction of accumulated litter, shifting only slightly. You follow that change in sound down from the shoulder into another stand of old cedars. The transition is immediate in the ground. Rocks remain underfoot, but the space between them deepens with organic matter. The slope gathers what the ridge sheds. Needles lie thicker. Cone fragments catch in small depressions. Here and there, a seam of darker soil runs between limestone blocks, not broad enough to notice from afar, yet broad enough to hold life in a different way. This is where the mountain's vertical logic becomes easier to understand. High cold is useful only if it stores water long enough to matter. Altitude by itself is not a gift. It becomes a gift when snow lingers in the right places, melts gradually, and enters soils and fissures before dry heat returns. If that sequence is interrupted, then the advantages of elevation narrow. The trees may still endure frost, they may still survive thin soils, but the old timing that once connected winter abundance to summer persistence becomes less dependable. And at that point, the landscape begins sorting more strongly according to slope, aspect, and subsurface storage. That sorting has already followed you all day. Now it feels sharper because the night's cooling strips everything down to essentials. You stop near a cedar with a trunk wide enough to hide a person completely. Its bark is black-gray in the dark, except where old plates have lifted and left paler bands beneath. The base of the trunk flares around embedded stones, and between those stones, the duff has settled deep enough to hold a narrow crescent of coolness. Several seedlings stand there, no taller than your shin. They have chosen, or rather been permitted by chance and condition, to begin within the tree's strongest zone of influence. This old cedar still moderates enough ground to start another generation. That fact matters more now than it might have under a colder, more reliable regime. Once, perhaps many parts of the slope offered some workable degree of establishment. Now the difference between shaded and unshaded ground is more decisive. A mature crown does not only reduce light, it changes temperature through the whole day. It affects how long frost remains in morning shade. It slows the afternoon loss of soil moisture. It shapes where litter gathers and where snow drifts. A broad old cedar is a weather system at a very local scale. As some of those systems thin or disappear, regeneration narrows with them. This is why the grove's future feels increasingly tied to architecture, not just to species presence, but to structure. A forest with old crowns, fallen trunks, nurse wood, deep duff, and cool hollows can still create favorable intervals for the young. A forest reduced to scattered stems over exposed stone may still produce cones, but it struggles to produce continuity. The difference between those two conditions can emerge slowly, then suddenly feel obvious once the pattern has gone far enough. You are standing in that kind of obviousness now. The old tree before you still holds a coherent patch of cedar climate beneath it. Not far away, another elder of similar age no longer does. Its crown is too open, its needles too sparse, its shadow too broken by sky. At its base, there are cones, fragments of bark, and dry herbs, but no young cedars. The comparison is difficult because it is so quiet. Nothing announces a threshold more softly than one tree still functioning and another just beyond it. A little later, the mountain gives you another version of the same lesson. You come to a line where the slope tilts northward, only slightly. The change is almost trivial on paper. A few degrees of aspect, a modest fold in topography. But the air is cooler there, and the ground shows it. Needles remain darker. Lichens are more continuous on the shaded rock. A little mat of moss survives at the base of a ledge. The cedars are not suddenly lush. This is still a dry mountain forest. Yet the northward turn has preserved enough of the old moisture rhythm that the stand feels less strained. There are more young trees. Not many, but enough that the age classes no longer break so sharply between ancient and absent. This is the sort of place that may matter disproportionately in years ahead. Not a dramatic sanctuary, just a slope that faces away from the worst of summer. That, in mountain ecology, can be enough to change the whole future of a patch. North-facing ground receives less direct heating during the hottest part of the day. Snow may linger longer there in late winter. Soils lose moisture more slowly in spring. Night cooling often recovers more efficiently in shaded positions. For a long-lived species with very slow recruitment, those modest differences accumulate into major consequences. A seedling surviving one extra summer is not a small event. It may be the difference between reaching a deeper fracture and disappearing before the first true root system forms. You continue into this cooler exposure and find more evidence close to the ground. A line of seedlings follows a shallow crack in the limestone where wind-blown soil has collected for years. A sapling no older than a decade rises beside a dead branch that trapped litter and gave it shade. Another young cedar has emerged under the low sweep of an old limb that still touches near the ground, creating a darker pocket beneath the canopy edge. All of these placements show the same principle. The grove is no longer regenerating by broad spread, it is regenerating by precision. Each young tree is tied to a local arrangement of matter and shade. The mountain after dark makes that precision easier to trust because you can feel it bodily. One place holds coolness around your ankles. Another releases the day's warmth upward from bare stone. One patch smells of damp needles and resin. The next smells thin, dry, and mineral. The trees are living within those same differences, only more completely and without pause. Farther along, the northward slope deepens into a shallow basin. This is not a valley, only a collected space inside the mountain's larger surface. Still, its effect is unmistakable. The cedars here stand taller, straighter, and closer than the ones on nearby shoulders. The crown layer is fuller. The ground beneath remains softer. When you touch the soil under the needles, there is still a trace of retained moisture below the upper dry layer. That retained moisture has many parents. Winter snow likely drifted more heavily into this depression. Cold air settles here at night. The sun leaves early behind the basin wall. Organic matter gathers rather than slipping away. Roots and fungal threads have had longer continuity in relatively buffered ground. No single cause explains the difference. That is important. Mountain ecosystems almost never hinge on one factor alone. They are built by overlap. This basin is a place where several modest advantages meet. And because they meet, the grove still behaves more like itself here. The old trees are healthier, the shade is more coherent. The seedling layer, though still sparse by lowland standards, is present enough to suggest ongoing replacement over long spans. You linger because this is the clearest answer yet to what the cedar landscape may become. Not absent, not unchanged. More dependent on scattered buffered places. If warming winters and reduced snowpack continue to pressure exposed stands, then basins like this, north-facing folds, deeper fracture zones, and heavily structured old groves may carry a larger share of the species' future. The pattern contracts inward. It retreats into topographic memory. What used to be broadly suitable becomes selectively suitable. That is not the same as disappearance, but it is a meaningful narrowing. Near the center of the basin stands another elder cedar, remarkable not only for size, but for composure. Its crown is broad and layered, with enough living foliage to cast a full patch of darkness beneath it. The trunk is hollowed on one side, yet still thick and stable around the opening. A strip of moonlit sky shows through the cavity from certain angles. Birds have likely nested in that chamber. Insects certainly work its inner wood. Fungi have shaped the cavity over years, and still the living outer shell lifts water to the crown each season. This one tree is almost a whole ecosystem folded around a single axis. When an elder like this remains vigorous enough to hold structure, its importance extends beyond beauty. It is a long-term moderator. The shade beneath it sustains cooler soil. The trunk slows wind, the root zone anchors organic matter, the hollow creates habitat, the fallen litter deepens the floor. The partial decay in one part of the tree does not cancel the living function of the rest. Instead, age multiplies roles. That multiplication is another reason old cedars cannot be quickly replaced in ecological terms, even if a younger tree eventually occupies the same point on a map. The younger tree will not yet have the hollow, the deep bark furrows, the broad winter shadow, the accumulated litter pattern, or the decades of fungal association. Old age is not just size, it is layered function. You move on, carrying that thought, and the path drops slightly out of the basin onto another, more exposed run of slope. At once, the structure loosens. The difference is as clear at night as it was in daylight. The crowns separate, the ground opens, the smell of dry herbs returns from thin patches between stones. Here, a few old trunks remain, but they no longer compose a continuous cedar interior. They stand more like remnants of one. There is enough canopy to suggest what was once present, but not enough to maintain it fully. This is where the mountain's unresolved character is most visible. The grove is still there, yet it is also partly past tense. You can imagine deeper shade once lying across this slope for longer hours. You can imagine litter gathering more steadily. You can imagine more seedlings beginning in years when winter held longer and spring dried later. Now the system still operates, but with gaps. The openings are not enormous. That almost makes them more affecting. They are just large enough to break continuity. And once continuity breaks in a dry mountain forest, each opening becomes a small experiment with uncertain results. Sometimes the next generation begins at the edge, sometimes it does not. Sometimes another species uses the light first. Sometimes the ground simply becomes hotter and less stable for cedar establishment. The consequences unfold quietly, but they diverge. You find an example at the base of a weathered limestone block where a cone has fallen and opened among sparse litter. The seed rain reached this place. The stone even offers a little protection on one side, and yet no cedar has taken hold. Nearby, Under a denser canopy remnant only a short distance away, there are several seedlings in almost identical substrate. The difference is not in seed availability. It is in the hours of heat, the continuity of shade, the small buffering effects that once extended farther across the slope than they do now. Again, the mountain returns to the same lesson. The future is not absent, it is constrained. Because this is a sleep script, the temptation might be to let everything soften into pure atmosphere here. But the grove has earned something more attentive. Its quiet is not empty quiet. It is full of linked processes, each one gentle, each one consequential. So you keep following the evidence, rather than floating above it. At the edge of the open run, a dead cedar lies angled downhill, its roots still partly anchored in a shallow tear of soil and stone. The trunk is pale along the upper side and darker where it touches the ground. Needles no longer remain on its branches. Even so, it changes the slope around it. Litter gathers on the uphill side. A slight line of retained moisture persists under the wood. On the lee side, a small terrace has formed from years of trapped particles. And in that terrace, two tiny cedars are growing. This is one of the grove's most persistent gifts to itself. When living structure weakens, dead structure can still continue the work in altered form. A fallen tree becomes hydrology close to the ground. It slows runoff. It shades the soil immediately beneath it. It traps the ingredients of future soil. In climates under increasing stress, those modest functions become even more important. The mountain is losing some forms of moderation and leaning more heavily on others. An intact crown cools from above. A fallen trunk cools from beside and below. A hollow stand shades broadly. A nurse log shelters narrowly. Both matter. Both hold continuity across different stages of the forest's life. The moon has risen high enough now that some openings in the canopy hold a faint silver brightness. It is not enough to light the forest floor evenly. Instead, it catches upper limbs, the edges of rock, and the smoothest plates of bark. The old cedars respond beautifully to this limited light. Their crowns flatten into layered silhouettes. The dead snags and branch stubs show brightest of all. The living needles remain dark, absorbing more than they reflect. That contrast reminds you again how much of the grove's life is hidden. The pale, visible skeletons are only part of the story. Below them, in shadow, roots, fungi, stored soil moisture, and sheltered seedlings continue the slower work that keeps the landscape from becoming memory alone. You follow a contour line along the mountain, and after a time the grove begins to thin toward an outer edge where cedar gives way to more open highland ground. This edge is not abrupt. The transition happens through spacing. Trees stand farther apart. Between them, limestone shelves widen. Cold air slips more freely down slope. The feeling is still peaceful but less enclosed. Edges like this matter because they show where the forest must negotiate most directly with exposure. A cedar near the interior gains some protection from neighboring crowns. A cedar near the edge receives more wind, more sun, and often less accumulated organic matter around its base. It lives with fewer buffers that can shape both the form of the tree and the prospects of the young beneath it. The edge stand you enter now bears those marks clearly. The cedars are often lower and broader. Their crowns begin closer to the trunk. Branches on the windward side are shorter. Dead wood is more visible. The ground beneath them is patchier, with islands of duff separated by exposed rock and dry herb cover. There are still seedlings in certain root hollows and on the protected side of boulders, but the pattern is more precarious than within the basin. This is a useful comparison because it clarifies how the same species occupies several ecological versions of the mountain at once. Interior stands, especially in cool basins or shaded folds, may still sustain a relatively complete cedar climate. Outer stands, exposed ridges and edge habitats may remain occupied by old trees while offering weaker regeneration. Both are part of the same landscape. Yet their futures are diverging. That divergence may become one of the defining features of the grove over time. The mountain keeps splitting conditions into finer categories, You stop at the edge of one open shelf and look back through the trees. Now, from this angle, the forest appears as a set of layered dark masses stepping down the slope. Some crowns are dense enough to make solid shapes, others are feathery and broken, admitting stars between the branches. The distinction, even at a distance, begins to correspond with what you have learned up close. A denser mass likely marks a better watered pocket, a fuller stand, an area where canopy still sustains interior conditions. A broken silhouette may mark drought-thinned elders, widened gaps, a stand depending more on memory than on recruitment. The mountain has become readable. That reading does not remove mystery. It deepens it by giving causes to what first seemed only beautiful. On the open shelf itself, small details keep instructing the same way. A crack in the limestone holds enough wind-blown matter for grasses but no cedar. A nearby notch, shaded by a low branch, holds one cedar seedling among the grasses. Farther on, a tiny hollow where winter snow probably rests a little longer contains a cluster of seedlings and one older sapling, so even at the forest margin, establishment is not impossible. It is simply more dependent on exact combinations. This is what ecological narrowing looks like on the ground. The species persists across the broader landscape, but its successful forward movement withdraws into microsites with the right geometry. Over long periods, that can reshape the whole character of the grove without requiring a sudden event. You leave the edge and re-enter deeper cedar shade because the mountain seems to ask it. The best way to understand what remains is to keep returning to the places where the old forest still holds together. Back among the denser trunks, the night feels cooler again. An owl calls once from farther downslope. The sound folds into the grove and rests there. The path is softer. The air smells richer. Resin, old needles, faint decomposition, limestone cooling after heat. These scents belong to a functioning cedar interior, and their persistence is itself a sign. Where enough canopy remains, the forest still creates its own atmosphere. That phrase can sound poetic. Here, it is also literal. The canopy alters humidity near the ground. The litter alters temperature. The roots alter infiltration. The forest generates conditions that support more forest. Every old standstill doing that work matters. You come to another slight depression filled with accumulated litter and the remains of many seasons' conefall. Several seedlings stand within it, and among them one sapling is noticeably older, with a sturdy stem and multiple short branch whorls. This little tree may have survived a decade or more. That fact deserves a moment of stillness. It has lived through many summers by staying close to the ground, adding almost no height and giving most of its effort to roots you cannot see. That is how persistence often looks here now. Not dramatic growth, but careful continuation. The young cedar has found a seam where litter stays in place, where the old canopy still lowers the afternoon heat, and where winter moisture must linger just a little longer than it does nearby. Its whole future depends on that arrangement remaining intact. If the elder above loses more of its crown, this patch will warm. If the duff dries and thins, the soil will release water sooner. If several poor winters arrive close together, the roots of this sapling may never reach the deeper fractures that would make it secure. So even this small success contains a condition. The grove is still writing forward, but it is doing so with narrower margins than before. You stand and look outward again through the dark trunks, and the mountain now seems full of those margins. Everywhere there are signs of endurance, and everywhere there are limits being approached. An old cedar with enough crown to hold a pocket of coolness. A hollow giant still standing, though reduced. A fallen trunk becoming nursewood. A basin that still gathers enough winter to support another generation. An exposed shelf where the seed arrives, but the future does not begin. These are not separate stories. They are one mountain process, unfolding at different speeds in different places. And because the process is uneven, the grove does not resolve into a simple ending. It becomes more complicated, and in that complication, more truthful. You continue walking, though now the pace feels slower still. The need to search has softened. What the grove needed to show has already been shown in bark, stone, seedlings, and shade. So the mountain after dark becomes a place for gathering those pieces back together. The limestone beneath the cedars stores almost nothing by itself. It must crack, weather, and hold pockets of reddish soil before roots can enter. Snow must fall high on the slopes and remain long enough to matter. Meltwater must move downward through fractures and pores where the ground can keep it. Fungi must meet roots below the surface and extend what those roots can reach. Old crowns must lower summer heat enough for litter to deepen and seedlings to last. When all of that overlaps, a cedar grove forms. And when that overlap loosens, the grove does not vanish at once. It thins. It separates into stronger and weaker rooms. It begins depending more heavily on the best protected parts of the mountain. That is the larger shape of what you have been walking through all day. Not an untouched forest, and not a lost one. A living slope in transition where resilience remains real, but no longer evenly distributed. The night air is colder now. The resin scent has become cleaner, sharper, almost crystalline in the high dark. The trunks rise around you with less detail than before, only mass and posture, yet the ground remains legible in a quieter way. Where needles lie deep, the step is soft. Where stone nears the surface, the sound changes slightly. Where an old root lifts the duff into a low ridge, your foot knows it before your eyes do. The mountain is still speaking through touch. You come to a place where the grove opens just enough to reveal a long slope descending into darkness. Across that darkness, cedar stands occupy the higher folds in broken bands, some broad, some thin, some continuous, some interrupted by pale runs of exposed limestone. From here, the whole landscape looks ancient in the simplest possible way. Tree, rock, cold air, distance. It would be easy to stop there, to let the scene become only atmosphere. But because you have moved so carefully through the details, the wide view carries more meaning than it did at the beginning. You know what may be hidden inside each dark band of forest. You know that one stand may still hold deep litter and scattered young trees beneath healthy elders. Another may contain trunks already silvering, crowns opening, and ground warming before the season should. Another may survive because a basin gathers snow. Another may fail to renew because the ridge beside it now dries too soon. The mountain is not one answer. It is a mosaic of slightly different questions. That is what makes the Atlas cedar groves feel both old and unsettled. Their beauty does not come from permanence. It comes from duration under pressure, a long ability to remain, even as the terms of remaining slowly change. You follow the slope downward between two broad trunks, and the forest closes around you once more. In this denser interior, the cool is almost complete now. The day's warmth survives only in the highest stone. Near the ground, the grove belongs to night. A faint insect sound rises and falls among the roots. Somewhere far off, an owl calls again, then lets the silence return. Nothing else insists on being heard. That silence suits the cedars. They are trees of patient accumulation. Their cones take time. Their growth takes time. Their decline, when it comes, also takes time. Even the deadwood remains useful for years, sometimes decades, before becoming soil. Everything in the grove is stretched across long intervals. That is why standing here can feel so restful. The mountain is not asking for quick understanding. It allows you to notice one relation at a time. A trunk and its shade, a root and a crack in limestone, a fallen limb and the moisture it holds beneath, a sapling and the old canopy that still protects it. One by one, these relations explain the whole place. And one by one, they reveal what is at stake when the overlap between them weakens. Ahead, the path levels over a broad shelf where needles have gathered in a darker, deeper layer. This part of the grove seems to hold the night more fully than the rest. The trunks are large. The crowns still meet in places overhead. The air is still enough that the scent of cedar bark and cooling earth remains close to where it formed. You stop here because the forest feels complete in this pocket, Not perfect, but coherent. An old stand like this is more than a collection of surviving trees. It is a set of conditions held together: moderated temperature, sheltered litter, stored moisture, repeated seed fall, protected microsites where another generation might begin. When one element weakens, the others become harder to maintain. When enough remain, the system still works. You can feel that functioning here without needing to describe every piece again. The floor is soft, the dark is gentle, the canopy still does its old work. And because it does, the grove around you seems to breathe more slowly. There is a kind of comfort in that, not because the future is certain. It is not, but because continuity still exists in material form. The old pattern has not been erased. It survives in these pockets with real force. That survival matters all the more because it is no longer universal. A mountain grove under changing climate does not simply become less, it becomes more selective. Some places hold the old rhythm longer, some lose it sooner. The future begins to gather around those differences, so the question is no longer only whether the Atlas cedar remains in the Middle Atlas. The question is where the forest can still create itself from within. Where can it still cool the ground enough for the duff to deepen? Where can roots still reach delayed moisture in time? Where can a seedling survive enough summers to become a sapling? Where can a sapling survive enough winters and dry seasons to begin making shade of its own? Those questions are small in scale but immense in consequence. They determine whether a grove remains a grove or becomes only a scattering of old survivors above warming stone. You kneel one final time and let your hand rest on the forest floor. The uppermost needles are dry and light. Below them, the layer changes. It cools. The texture grows finer. There is still cohesion here, built by decay and fungal binding and repeated seasons of fall and retention. This is the quiet substance of the grove's continuity, not the impressive trunk alone, but the patient making of a surface where life can begin again. In many mountain forests, the floor is where change first becomes irreversible. When shade thins too much, it dries. When it dries, decomposition changes. When decomposition changes, moisture storage weakens. When moisture storage weakens, seedlings lose their chance. So to find this deeper layer still present is to find evidence that the old system remains active, at least in places. Your hand lifts, and the scent of resin and earth follows faintly. Above you, the old branches hold still against the stars. They have held against many things: snow load, dry summers, wind from the high ridges, years of better moisture and years of less. Some of the cedars around you may be several centuries old. That means they began under winters colder than these, under a moisture rhythm with more dependable storage, under mountain conditions that made broad continuity easier than it seems now. They have lasted because the species is resilient, yes, but also because the mountain, for a very long time, kept offering enough of what they needed. The concern now is not that the cedars were ever delicate. It is that even a durable species can be slowly misaligned from the climate that shaped it. That misalignment is what you have seen in thinning crowns, in silvered trunks, in the growing importance of north-facing hollows and nursewood. And yet the lesson never settled into hopelessness, because every time the mountain showed loss, it also showed a mechanism of persistence nearby. A sapling under an elder, a seedling line in a shaded crack, a basin where the canopy still holds, a fallen log continuing the work of shade. The future, here, is not a grand return to some undisturbed condition. It is a quieter possibility that enough of these small continuities remain connected across enough favorable years for the grove to keep writing forward in reduced but living form. You begin walking again, and the path turns gently toward a final open place between the trees. The slope there widens into a kind of overlook, though there is no built edge, no boundary, only a natural pause where the trunks thin and the mountain reveals itself in layers. The cedar crowns stand black against a sky now full of stars. Limestone shelves hold the palest remaining traces of reflected light. The air feels very high, very clear, and very still. From here, The grove is both near and far at once, near in scent, in bark texture, in the deep padding of needles at your feet. Far in its long time scale, in its centuries of growth, decline, and renewal beyond any single walk, you stay there without needing to decide anything. The mountain does not offer conclusions in the ordinary sense. It offers relationships that continue after you stop naming them. Rock storing and releasing water, trees shaping temperature, fungi carrying exchange underground, deadwood becoming shelter for the next root, old crowns preserving pockets where young cedars can still begin. These processes will go on tonight without witness. They will go on through winter if snow comes. They will go on through spring if seepage lingers. They will continue through another hot season, testing each stand according to its depth, shade, and exposure. Some trees will endure another year almost unchanged. Some will lose a little more. Some seedlings will disappear. A few will hold on. That is the mountain's slow arithmetic. And because it is slow, it asks to be met with patience rather than verdict. The final feeling of the grove is not resolution, it is attentiveness. You know more now than when the day began. You know that the Atlas cedar landscape is built on altitude, limestone, snow, roots, fungal exchange, shade, and time. You know that warming, reduced snowpack, and shifting moisture timing are altering that balance from within. You know that old trees are not easily replaced, and that regeneration is retreating into cooler refuges and protected microsites. You know that the grove is diminished in places, but not silent. And perhaps most importantly, you know that this forest remains most itself, not in broad statements, but in local acts of moderation. One hollow, one crown, one patch of duff, one patient sapling at a time. The night deepens further. The stars sharpen. The owl does not call again. The grove seems content to let its last words remain unspoken. You can sense the old trunks all around you, rooted in fractured stone, holding their forms against the cold air. You can sense the small trees below them, nearly invisible now, waiting in the shelter that still exists. You can sense the mountain itself beneath all of it, storing little, giving little, yet through its cracks and folds, allowing this high forest to continue. That may be the quietest truth the day has led toward. The Atlas cedar groves were never forests of abundance in the easy sense. They were always forests of exact conditions, of thin margins, successfully held for a very long time. What has changed is not their character, but the narrowness of those margins. The same patience that once built the grove is now what preserves it in fragments. So you remain a moment longer at the edge of the high dark slope. No wind moves. No branch falls. No conclusion arrives. There is only the scent of resin in cold air, the faint pale of limestone under starlight, and the enduring shape of cedars spread across the mountain in uneven bands of shadow. Some stands are still full. Some are opening. Some small hollows are quietly preparing another generation. And somewhere